Our perspective is obviously the one of an organization which on the one hand represents the non-governmental actors here in Brussels, and in that context is active towards the European institution, and on the other hand an umbrella organization representing churches which are active on the ground with and for refugees. In both spheres, it's very important for us, of course, to make sure that those who are so far numbers become humans and stories and individual beings. What we need to do in the future is probably, first of all, analyze further. I think something which probably has not been coming across so clearly. We often sat in front of the results and thought that would be interesting to look into in more detail. So I think we and some other studies have covered some ground, but there's a lot of details we would like to know more about. So that is something which I think is very, very important. I think we need to share the analysis here. There were a number of surprises there, the more positive tone which we had in the media, some differentiation which was there which we didn't think, but then again some of the things which we had unfortunately be anticipating which turned out to be true. Invisibility of refugees, the invisibility of women in that whole thing, and the whole fact that a human rights framework is not really of any consideration in what's been reported. I think what's been important in the project was that there was a good dynamic in the end between representatives of refugee organizations and media representatives, media professionals. We had a heated debate. It was good that the debate was behind closed doors, but a number of really important questions came out which are also a bit bigger than just, oh, these journalists, oh, these refugee representatives. I think it was a very big question about the quality journalism and its future and the space for it. I think there was a growing understanding of some of the refugee organization representatives how difficult it is often for journalists, particularly journalists who don't have the standing, not necessarily in their own newsroom, to come across with differentiated, fact-based, maybe a bit more quiet representation of refugees in their stories. I think there was the question, how can we bring across something which might often be very unspectacular? The success stories Bogmi has been speaking about. We all know good news is basically no news. So how can we create space for that? And is there any space for interesting media and boring facts, which are not as interesting? There's lots of these iconic photographs. Refugees are always arriving in a boat. All migrants are always arriving in a boat. 2 weeks ago, our Italian colleagues published the statistical review of Italy, a country where everybody thinks of Lampedusa, arrivals per boat. The reality is the ordinary migrant, the ordinary refugee to Italy comes in a minibus from somewhere or overstays a visa. That is not as exotic as it is to report about a boat with 500 people arriving, but that's more of a reality. So how do we deal with that? Is that any newsworthiness behind there? I think it's not as easy as the European Commission in its recent call for proposals on reporting on migration said, to say, to teach journalists how to find correct facts about migration. I think that's a bit of a simplistic approach to it. I think we need to be more interested in saying, okay, can we strike a deal, something which serves a refugee organization interest and yet is interesting from a journalistic point of view? And I think we've been able to cover some ground there, and we're very, very keen on taking that further. What do we need to find for our own ranks? I think I'm always saying we can only ask from public institutions and media to be as good as we are as an organization of the churches. And yes, in our own midst, the visibility of refugees, the participation, the leadership of refugees is something which is not always taken for granted. So I think we need to get better than that. We need to be very, very clear that we are not engaging with refugee issues and refugee stories on the basis of being charitable or being so much touched by it. It's good if we're these both things, but we should start from a rights perspective, have the human rights framework in our mind. I think the whole question of being overprotective is something we really need to look into much more. There were these stories from different points, refugee camps here, Calais jungle and others, where media professionals were saying, well, we can't get the original voices because you're being overprotective. I mean, anybody who's ever been in a place like Idomeni, for example, will know why organizations try to be protective of refugees, because some of that often becomes basically a big media circus. But then again, yes, there is a legitimate interest to have the refugee voice heard. There's the agency of refugees. So I think we need to very, very carefully calibrate that, how protective we are. I think we as churches have a specific role, and that goes back to one of the slogans of refugee activism, nothing about us without us. I think we have in the charitable and diaconal work we do an important role to say, well, where do refugees play a role there? Not as an only receiver of the work we do, but being part and parcel of the work being carried out. I think that's very, very important. In advocacy, very often we formulate our advocacy messages somewhere from the high ground of an organization sitting in Brussels, but where have refugees put into it? Where is the refugee voice clearly recognizable? How does it look in our own networks? Where our organization has moved from a mission statement which says we work for refugees and migrants to say with and for refugees and migrants, but we're still a bit behind in implementing that, I think. And where are we in the communication with welcoming societies? Churches always have a very important role in being one of the first organizations which welcomes refugees into the new communities. Do we do that speaking to the people of the welcoming communities, or are refugees part and parcel of doing that? I think that's very, very important. I think we have lots of own church media, and there some of the recommendations we've developed would be very, very important. The focus on the person, but also looking at some of the standard setting. Standard setting is not everything, but I think it's very, very important to engage in these processes which are owned. And last not least, I think all of that should be happening in what Prezes Rekowski has been describing. Let's paint pictures of opportunity. And I think that way we can maybe improve the narrative, challenge the existing one, and change it in the end. Thank you.